Show of hands, who here is old enough to have ever used a typewriter? I took typing class, and it was on a typewriter. I'm that old. Typewriters started off with a mechanism that looked like this. You press the button on the keyboard for a specific letter, but then a little arm, a little bar, would swing up from the guts of the keyboard and smack that letter into the inked typewriter ribbon, and thereby press the imprint of that letter onto the paper, right? So that was the mechanism. Each keystroke on the typewriter would cause a piece of metal to fling itself up toward the paper, a different little bar with a different letter on it for each keystroke. That was how they started out. But then, in 1961, IBM changed all that. IBM invented a whole new kind of electric typewriter, where instead of each letter, each number, each character having its own little type bar that would swing up and onto the paper every time you hit a keyboard, a stroke on the keyboard, instead, Selectric typewriters just have this little ball, a little kiwi or like a little golf ball. They called it the font element, and you could change out that ball for a different ball if you wanted to have a different font to type with. And the innovation here was that with the Selectric, instead of a distinct and different piece of individual piece of metal flinging itself up at the paper for every letter that you typed, now it was just this one piece of metal, this little ball that would rotate and pivot to position the appropriate letter or number or character in line with the ribbon to make its mark on the page. It was a big engineering advance in terms of the way typewriters worked, and it definitely changed typing. But it turns out it also changed spying. Because starting in the 1970s, Soviet Union invented secret, small technology that could be fitted inside an IBM Selectric typewriter. And they disguised it really well, so the only way you could find this thing was by x-raying the typewriter and knowing what you were looking at. But what their spying device did inside a Selectric typewriter is that it could detect the movement of little arms and push rods inside the Selectric typewriter that positioned that ball, that pivoted and rotated that ball as you typed the letters and numbers that you wanted to appear on the page. They put a device inside Selectric typewriters that could feel the difference, that could detect the difference between that ball being rotated to type a letter X and that ball being rotated to type like a number 7. Turns out if you were sensitive enough in detecting the movements inside the Selectric to position that ball just the right way, you could detect an individual and specific signal that translated to each letter or number that was being typed. So this device inside the Selectric would listen in as you were typing, and then it would translate that information into a digital signal, and then it would transmit that digital signal to the KGB, to spies who were listening in on that typewriter. And in so doing, starting in the mid-1970s, again, the Selectric only existed from 1961, but by the mid-1970s, the Russians had so hacked it, they could essentially get a real-time broadcast of anything that was being typed on one of these IBM Selectric typewriters that they'd been able to get a bug into. It was absolute engineering spy genius. And from 1976 to 1984, there were 16 IBM Selectric typewriters at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow that were bugged by the Soviets with one of these bugs that could listen in to the little arms and push rods that moved the Selectric ball. And for 8 solid years, for those 8 years, everything typed on those 16 IBM Selectric typewriters was beamed directly to the KGB. And the only reason the U.S. figured it out in 1984 is because another country that had been bugged this same way by the KGB figured it out in one of their own facilities, and since they were our ally, they tipped us off that maybe we should check this. Hey, are you guys using Selectric typewriters, particularly at your embassies and consulates in Russia? You may want to get them x-rayed and check for this particular sophisticated bug that the Russians made up and that we have found them using against us. So those 16 compromised IBM Selectric typewriters, those were an intelligence disaster for the United States for 8 solid years as they broadcast everything typed inside the embassy. But they were finally discovered in 1984. And when that got found out in 1984, that was a time when we were finding out a lot of other things that were very, very bad about our embassy and the Russians' spying on us and spying on that embassy around that time. One of the biggest scandals, one of the biggest failures ever on the part of the United States when it came to spying in Russia started in 1969, when then President Richard Nixon came to a hard-fought agreement with the Soviet Union. And the agreement was that the Soviets would be allowed to build a new Soviet embassy in Washington, and we, simultaneously, would be allowed to build a new American embassy in Moscow. That was agreed to after much negotiation in 1969. They weren't actually ready to start construction itself in Moscow until a decade later in 1979. And if you think about that time in modern U.S. history, this is a very chilly part of the Cold War, right? And by the time the U.S. was ready to start construction on our new embassy in Moscow in 1979, the sure fact that that embassy would be a target of advanced Russian spying operations was very much on American officials' minds. It was very much in American news. I mean, this was a front and center concern about building a new embassy in Moscow. Not just because U.S. and Russian spies were always targeting each other, but also because right before we started construction, we had just discovered a major Russian intelligence operation for them to spy on our existing facilities in Moscow. This is a news report from 1978, the year before we started building the new embassy. Part of the reason I want to show this is because it's relevant to this story, but part of the reason I want to show it is because of the amazing graphics in this news report. Watch.
The most recent Soviet-American rift involves the discovery of yet another Soviet listening device in the American embassy in Moscow. Events of this kind are not always made public, but this one, discovered on May 25th, was disclosed by American officials today. Ford Rowan has the details.
The Russian KGB agents operated out of an apartment building just across the street from the American embassy. They used a cable which ran from the listening post through a secret tunnel under the street, into the embassy basement, and up a ventilating shaft to the 7th floor. American personnel found surveillance equipment in the shaft, including a disc-shaped antenna-like device. During the search, the Americans surprised a Russian agent who fled from his listening post.
So in 1969, Nixon had agreed with the Russians that they would get to build a new embassy here, and that we would get to build a new embassy there. Then all through the 70s, we continued to discover the Russians bugging our existing embassy and our diplomatic facilities in Russia, including them having a secret tunnel under the street into our embassy as late as 1978. But then in 1979, we started building our new embassy in Moscow. And it's now clear in retrospect that in that decision, we made what is now, quite obviously, in retrospect, an absolutely ridiculous error as a country, right? And this was a high-level negotiated thing. You know, the highest levels of the administration were involved in negotiating this fact that the Russians get to build their embassy and we get to build our embassy, and it's simultaneous, and there's a big team of high-level government people negotiating the exact terms under which all the construction will be managed, right? This is something that the government worked really hard on over a period of years, but somehow at the end of that process, the U.S. agreed to a deal that had a major flaw. See if you can figure out what it was. On the Russia side of the equation, when they were building their embassy in Washington, their part of the deal said that all building materials for their embassy would be constructed on site. They had Soviet officials on site overseeing every aspect of the construction down to the level of every single beam, every single board. Everything that went into that embassy was cut and cast and assembled at the building site under their own people's supervision. And just to be doubly safe, every component that went into building the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. was x-rayed piece by piece as it was put together to make sure there was no funny business, there was no CIA bugs for the Russian embassy. Right? Nothing had been inserted into the construction materials somehow. That was the Russian side of the deal. The American side of the deal was different. The American side of the deal for our building in Moscow, U.S. government negotiated that, yes, American workers and American officials would be responsible for all the finish work, like the fine work inside the building. But when it came to the basic guts of the building, like the beams and the concrete and the precast floor panels and all the columns, those would all be prefab manufactured in Soviet facilities by Soviet workers and then brought complete onto the construction site where the U.S. would watch, basically, while the Russian workers assembled our new embassy for us in Moscow. Who made this deal? So yeah, like American workers got to put in the windows and the doors and stuff. And when it came to the actual building, that was built by the Russians for us. Oh, it's very nice of them. They controlled the design. They controlled all the fundamental construction. The building of that embassy in Moscow started in 1979. By 1979, by 80, by 81, by 82, the U.S. realized we had a serious problem on our hands with that building. These 7,000-pound precast pieces of the building were arriving at the building site to be installed in the new embassy. They were arriving completely made. People who were in charge of making sure the embassy wasn't going to be spied on said from the very beginning, whoa, this is going to be a problem. The U.S. had security engineers reviewing the construction materials as best they could, but the Russians were running the design and the construction process. By 1982, the U.S. government was so worried that we had secretly dispatched a specially trained team of bug detectors for the still under construction building. And I kid you not, they were trained rock climbers. They put dudes in rock climbing harnesses and special cold weather gear that had been supplied by Eddie Bauer. And in the dead of night, in the dead of the Moscow winter, with temperatures dipping to 40 degrees below zero, they had these guys, these specialists, rappelling down the sides of the building under construction with specially made X-ray machines to try to find all the Russian bugs. And boy, did they find a lot of Russian bugs. New York Times did a great recap in 1988 as to what had gone wrong with the case of the bugged embassy. Quote, they discovered interconnecting systems so sophisticated they couldn't be removed from the steel and concrete columns, the beams, the precast floor slabs, the sheer walls between the columns. They found electronic packages where a piece of steel reinforcement in the flooring should have been. They found resonating devices that allowed the Russians to monitor electronic and verbal communications. One engineer who worked on the site from 1980 to 1982 said, quote, we found things that didn't belong there based on the shop drawings. We found cables in the concrete. And it wasn't like some low-level hack job. It was very sophisticated. Ron Kessler from the Washington Post later wrote a book that touched on this subject. It was a book called Moscow Station. He explained in his book how some of the bugs the Russians put in the construction process were found in places where metal beams were welded together, and they would make the bugs out of materials that had the same density as the metal in the joint. So even if you did X-ray that joint, you wouldn't detect them. So the U.S. government negotiated for that building in '69, started building it in '79. By the early '80s, they'd gotten rock climbers to be rappelling down the outside of the building and building in the dead of night, saying, this place is intrinsically bugged. By 1985, they actually stopped working on it when it was two-thirds done, and they kicked all the Russian workers out. And then the government appears to have had no idea what to do with their partially built, ruinously compromised KGB Christmas present that the U.S. taxpayers had just funded to the tune of many millions of dollars right in the heart of Moscow. And then on top of all that, the KGB won again at the U.S. Embassy, when for the first time in the history of the United States, a U.S. Marine was charged and convicted of espionage. KGB had sent young female officers to seduce and then blackmail U.S. Marines who were providing security at the existing American embassy facilities in Moscow while the new one was under construction. KGB knew it was illegal for the Marines to fraternize with local Russian women, so they did their best to get those Marines to break that rule, and then they squeezed them. They threatened to expose their wrongdoing unless these Marines helped them out. And so lots of young, attractive female KGB officers got all sorts of access to U.S. embassy facilities. In the worst instance, the Marine who was convicted of espionage and served 9 years in prison, he apparently handed over blueprints for the embassy facilities. And then as that Marine Moscow honey trap scandal was becoming public in 1987, the story also finally went public about the KGB embassy construction scam fiasco and how Russia was able to so intrinsically compromise the basic building bones of our embassy.
The new ambassador to Moscow, Jack Matlock, arrived today. His first job, secure the embassy. The State Department has asked the nation's top-secret national security agency to sweep the embassy before Secretary of State George Shultz arrives in 10 days. While Marines allegedly compromised the current embassy, lax security was just as damaging next door at the new embassy now under construction. These officials believe the new offices are bugged top to bottom. They recommend the building be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. The cost, more than $1 billion. When the Soviets built their new embassy complex in Washington, they insisted all building materials be constructed on site. Each beam and board was scrupulously x-rayed. But according to intelligence sources, American officials in Moscow were, quote, outplayed from the start. Soviet workmen precast the concrete off-site without American supervision. Workers on-site say security was a joke. The result? Sophisticated listening devices embedded in foundations, floors, and walls.
NBC Nightly News in Garrels reporting in 1987. This is a big deal, right? The Senate voted more than 2-1 that then Secretary of State George Shultz shouldn't go to Moscow as long as our embassy couldn't be rendered safe for his visit. Led to a big tit-for-tat fight with the Russians where we both expelled lots of people in both countries. It also led to a very frustrated and angry President Ronald Reagan.
I just wanted to come in here to tell you that I'm deeply concerned over the breach of security in our Moscow embassy. The United States will not occupy our new embassy building in Moscow unless and until I can be assured that it is safe to move into a secure embassy environment.
Well, Mr. President, if Gorbachev changes his mind, will you then allow Soviets to become re-employed at our embassy there? And how extensive is the problem in other Soviet bloc embassies?
We are investigating the whole area of embassies. So, listen, Frank is going to take all of your questions, unfortunately, and I'm not ducking you. I've tried to answer it.
Would you rehire them, sir, if Mr. Gorbachev changes his mind?
No, I think we should have our own personnel.
Would you rehire Soviet personnel to work at that site of the U.S. Embassy? No, we should have our own personnel. President Reagan, April 1987. President Reagan left office after serving 2 full terms in January 1989, and in January 1989, as one of the very last things he did as president, Ronald Reagan recommended that the entire U.S. Embassy in Moscow just be torn down, razed to the ground, start over. 5 years later, in 1994, the U.S. sort of partially did that. Some of the embassy was demolished, and new top floors were installed. Top floors. Installed by U.S. workers using U.S. materials under U.S. supervision this time. So at least those top floors of the embassy could be made secure. They did, however, just pop those new secure top floors on top of the old infected base of the building that we let the Russians put up for us. It was an absolutely ridiculous 25-year saga, that embassy. Today, Andrew Higgins, Moscow correspondent for the New York Times, reports on a new decision that has just been made about that embassy of ours in Moscow, a decision made by the U.S. State Department under Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. According to this new reporting, the U.S. State Department has just awarded a no-bid contract for security at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. It's a no-bid contract, $2.8 million contract, awarded without competition. That security contract has gone to, quote, a private Russian company that grew out of a security business co-founded by Vladimir Putin's former KGB boss, a veteran spy who spent 25 years planting agents in Western security services. Quote, security guards at the American Embassy in Moscow and at U.S. consulates in St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, and Vladivostok will be provided by Elite Security Holdings, a company closely linked to the former head of Soviet counterintelligence in the KGB. His name is Viktor Budanov. Viktor Budanov and Russian President Vladimir Putin worked closely together as KGB officers in East Germany. He has been vocally supportive of President Putin. Mr. Budanov helped start the firm, according to Russian sources quoted in the Times today. It's now run by his son, Dmitry. So, you know, what could go wrong? The firm that will now be screening visitors to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and otherwise handling security matters at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow is a Russian firm linked not just to Russian intelligence, but specifically to Vladimir Putin's former colleague in the KGB who rose to run counterintelligence for the Soviet Union. And at this point in the story, I would usually make some joke about, hey, why not just hand them the keys? But literally, they're going to be running security at the embassy, so they are going to have the keys. Again, a no-bid contract awarded by the State Department under Rex Tillerson, first reported today in the New York Times. Why would you do that?
Stupid.
President Trump returns from his longest overseas trip tonight. Even though it was a trip to Asia, he still managed to squeeze in 3 meetings with Russian President Vladimir Putin on this trip.
Suck ass.
Despite the fact that the White House never confirmed in advance whether or not those meetings would happen, luckily for us, the Kremlin and Russian media was able to let us know that those meetings had happened as our soonest notification as Americans. After his meetings with Putin, President Trump found time to